Guys, we have a lot to tackle, so if you want to open up to Acts chapter 16, we are getting into Paul's second missionary journey. It likely happened in AD 49, AD 50. If you know anything about Paul was one of those dudes that was able to be pretty strong and consistently strong, even though he was getting the snot beat out of him. Like, the dude was on a mission, and his mission was to make sure that everybody understood the good news of Jesus, how Jesus fulfilled the law, the Old Testament, and he brought salvation linked to it. Paul was on a mission to the Gentiles and to the Jews. He wanted to make sure that everybody understood that there was a saving grace, not just for the Jewish community, but for all. And now we get to come alongside of that message to celebrate, because all of us here, for the most part, are Gentiles as well. We've been grafted in to this loving God that wants a relationship with each and every single one of us. This isn't just something we do. This isn't just a religion full of activities, but this is everything within us. That Jesus has given us this intimate relationship with him. Now, before we get started in Acts chapter 16, we'll be reading from 13 to 34, but I need to catch you up to speed real quick, okay? Every time I've taught, you've noticed, I have to give you a little backstory. I don't get to do chapter by chapter, verse by verse with you, so therefore I have the longest intros ever. Please, buckle up. It's going to be great. It won't be too long, but we got this, okay? The first thing in chapter 16, 1 through 3, is we see that we meet Timothy. This young man that we later on know will end up being a pastor and a leader in the faith community of Christianity. We meet him and we find out that Paul really likes this young man. So much so that he says, listen, Timothy, I want you to come along with me. I want you to be with me. So we find out Timothy ends up tagging along with Paul in the various regions as they go and travel along the way. Verses 1 through 9, you see something interesting in chapter 16. What you see is a theme of the word they. The writer is telling us they went to this region, they talked to these people, they went here. If you know anything, when the writer is communicating in that way, he's oftentimes speaking not from personal perspective, but communicating as to where they're going. But we see a shift happen within verse 10, if you look at it. We see instead of the word they being used, it's changed now to we went here, we went there, we were going. What we see is it looks like that Luke along the way actually joined the party with Timothy, with Paul, and later on we're going to find out Silas will be a part of this, and we see now Luke. So we see these four men are going to be on this journey together as they go into Philippi, a land where it was in Europe, and it was a Roman colony, but we'll get there in a second. Verse 10, we find out in verses 9 and 10, Paul has a night vision or a dream. He has a night vision of a man, a Macedonian man, saying, Paul, come to Macedonia and help us. Come to Macedonia and help us. And I love it. Paul doesn't just be like, let me pray on that. Lord, is this you? No, Paul is like the dude that when God speaks, he goes. Paul immediately takes his homies and says, we are going to Macedonia. Now, before we get started, I need to preface this, okay? I full on am going to nerd out on you today, okay? I gathered a ton of information that really isn't super needed, but when I study, I get into all of these rabbit holes. I don't know if you're like me, but I get into these rabbit holes, and then they take me to like Narnia, and then I'm just like, what is happening? Like, this is the greatest moment ever. I just need to warn you. I may nerd out on you, but I hope you see something. When we read the word, yes, there is a spiritual element to it. Obviously, the word has a spiritual element for each and every single one of us. But the moment you are able to also see the physical, what was really happening in the reality of the time, it brings a lot of understanding with what was happening. And if you just think about this, if you were to go back in time 30 years ago and start talking about, oh yeah, my iPhone is in my pocket and I use that, the people would have been like, what the heck is an iPhone? What do you mean? What is this contraption that you could talk on? That you could touch? Like, it doesn't make sense. So we need to put ourselves in place and see what was happening, what were they experiencing, and what were the people involved in this time. So I'm going to nerd out on you. Please show me a little bit of grace. If it's too much, you could just start booing and I'll just get off the stage. It's great, okay? It'll be fine. It'll be wonderful. But we find out in verses 11 and 12 that they travel. They travel from Neapolis to Philippi. Something that you might not know, that was a roughly 10-mile stretch. A 10-mile stretch. Something that we overlook and oversee a lot of times is there was actually a literal road that they would walk. You could still visit it to this day. The road is called the Via Egnatia. The Via Egnatia. This road is very interesting because it was constructed by the Roman Empire, 2nd century BC. This road roughly went for a total of 696 miles. It was a long road. It was a very pinnacle road in the Roman Empire as well. The reason being, it was a big transport road, oftentimes going as far as Macedonia, and trade was a heavy route along this Via Egnatia road that traveled so very far. If you didn't know, the Roman roads were typically built roughly 20 feet wide. 20 feet wide, so that they could have horsemen, chariots, and also other people to travel along this road. This road was a very important road to the Roman Empire. We also find out that this road goes directly through Philippi. So what we can observe with this community in Philippi, this village, that it had some sort of connection to the Roman Empire, we'll get there, but also some sort of wealth because it was along a very trafficked road, okay? Now, the land of Philippi, Dougie, do you want to put that picture? You might not be able to see it very well and what it says, but there's Philippi. Philippi, if you can see, the greenery area is actually a hillside. That hillside, and right along that hillside, Philippi was nestled. They had an amphitheater up there because they were a Roman colony. It wasn't just a village, it was colonized by Rome. The reason that it was colonized, the Roman Empire would often use these colonies as a military might or force. They would build these colonies in strategic areas to make sure that they were in control of that land. Within these Roman colonies, they were called Little Romes or Mini Romes. The reason being is they abided by everything that the Roman Empire in Rome abided by. They would often bring certain customs and also architecture within these communities to influence the people. They would purposely put also Roman people and people that were sympathizers of the Roman Empire in those communities to make sure that they had control over that certain land, okay? We also find out they had a Roman garrison. I know this is just a lot of information, but it's good. We'll get there. They had a Roman garrison as well, which was a fortified building that would house Roman soldiers. So there was a law that was represented there, and people would abide by the Roman law in that time. Now that we've finally arrived to Philippi, this is where our story begins, okay? We're going to find out that the Jewish people don't represent too much within this colony. We're going to find out something that's happened with the Jewish people along the way as well. We're going to meet two characters. I'm just trying to go through this as fast as I can. We're going to meet two characters. And guess what? The two characters get saved and then baptized. It's pretty convenient since we're having baptism today. But guys, if God is speaking to you, if you have not given your life to the Lord, this is a sermon for you. There's going to be a lot of nerdy things along the way. But I want you to understand something, that God is real. That he's not just some made-up thing. If you look into the details, if you search out answers for yourself, time in and time out, what you are going to find is there is absolutely a creator of all of creation. A painting needs a painter. If you guys look into this, you understand that nothing just comes into existence without something moving it or bringing it into existence. We've experienced this firsthand as well. But I want you also to see something, that God is going to work through people, but he's also going to work throughout his creation. And it's awesome that God is calling each and every single one of us, opening our hearts, desiring that you would receive him. Now we have the responsibility of saying, yes, I receive. And what's so beautiful, time in and time out, after people were saved, they were also drawn to the water of baptism. That representation of being dead, dying by drowning, which what Matt Myers would say. And I was like, ooh, that's aggressive. Okay, but dying, like going down, submerged, death, our old man dies. The wants and desires that we wanted no longer matter. It's all about being brought back to life in Christ Jesus. Now we walk in a way that Christ wants us to walk. My goodness, let's read. Acts chapter 16, verse 13 is where we're going to start. And on the Sabbath day, we went outside the gate to a riverside, where we were supposing that there would be a place of prayer. And we sat down and began speaking to the women who had assembled. A woman named Lydia from the city of Thyatira, a seller of purple fabrics, a worshiper of God, was listening. And the Lord opened her heart to respond to the things spoken by Paul. Verse 15. And when she and her household had been baptized, she urged us, saying, if you have judged me to be faithful to the Lord, come into my house and stay. And she prevailed upon us. Okay, let's pause there really quickly. The first thing that we see is a glimpse inside of this city, Philippi, okay? The glimpse that we see is we do not see a synagogue. Typically, on the Sabbath day, the Jews would collect or gather in synagogues, and it was a place of teaching, of prayer, of counseling and correction. If you didn't understand, maybe when you were reading the scriptures, what's the difference from a synagogue and a temple? The temple was one location. The synagogue was multiple locations. The synagogue was like a church of sorts where people would gather in community, but the temple was obviously located in Jerusalem. Now, this temple is the same place where the high priest once a year would sacrifice upon the Day of Atonement or Yom Kippur. It was also the place where the Jews would have to gather 3 times a year for different feasts, okay? It was a different location, and the synagogue was in different villages. We find out that there is no synagogue, that they have to meet in a place of prayer. Now, what scholars have looked at and seen that this could have been maybe a small building of sorts, or it could have literally been outside under the open air, because we found out it was outside of the walls of Philippi along a river, okay? Along a river. Now, this is important for us to understand because in order for a synagogue to be present within a community or a colony, there had to be 10 Jewish males. Where that comes from is actually in Deuteronomy. Let me find it. No, not Deuteronomy. Genesis chapter 18. If you remember, it's Abraham pleading with God, saying, please do not kill Sodom and Gomorrah. What if there was 50 men? Would you wipe them out? What if there was 40 men? Would you wipe them out? What if? And he keeps going down and going and going down, and God says, no. And he gets to 10 and stops. So the Jewish custom was for 10 men to start a synagogue. So we see that there is not even 10 men to start a synagogue for the people, the Jewish people, to come together. So we're getting a little bit of the culture within Philippi. It was very Roman, not following Jesus. It was very Roman and not following Jesus. We also find out in this place of prayer that Paul and all of the guys crash a straight up ladies' night. Did you read that? They started chatting with all of the ladies. The girls were having the greatest girls' Bible study of all time, and then 4 homies come on in and say, hey, we're going to crash the party. But it also shows us something a little bit more, that the men of the community were not seeking the Lord. The men of the community were not seeking the Lord. Now, this is important as we move on. We get the culture of Philippi, but we also meet a character. Her name is Lydia. Lydia is from Thyatira, which is over 300 miles away from Philippi. It was a long ways away. We also find out that she was a seller of purple fabrics. If you know anything within the scriptures, you know when the color purple is referenced, it's usually referencing what? Hey, good job. Royalty, wealth, power. She was the seller of purple. This purple was oftentimes made from shellfish or murex, which is a sea snail, or roots of plants. They would use these colors within these items to create a purple fabric. And we know, like you just said, in the Roman Empire, it was the imperial authority or status, wealth. So we can find out that this lady was obviously doing pretty well for herself. She was doing pretty well for herself. We also find out that she invites these 4 guys to come and hang out with her in her house so that they have shelter along their journey. For 4 guys to be housed in your house, how many of you can invite, 4 people in different rooms to stay in your house? That's kind of starting to get crammed in there, especially if you have kids. Especially if your parents are there, especially, it starts to get a little crammed. So we could see that she was a wealthy lady. But there was something very important with Lydia that we needed to hone in on. Because sometimes this can be taken all sorts of ways, but what we see is that Lydia was a worshiper of God. Did you see that she identified as a worshiper of God? This phrase is often used in the book of Acts to identify or to talk about Gentile believers. Not Jewish believers, but Gentile believers. We find out that she was worshiping Jesus Christ, even though she hasn't received quite yet, but she knew of God, and she knew of his power. She's heard of the stories of old about God and his mighty force, his power over Pharaoh in Egypt. She's heard of these stories and maybe even has come in contact with a Jew and has received the word of God. But Paul was going to speak to her the good news of Jesus Christ. The good news of Jesus Christ. And guys, hopefully, when I speak of the good news, the gospel of Jesus Christ, that isn't just something that we turn off. And that scares me a lot of times because I've been in this same boat. I have heard the good news talked about so much. If you are like me, you've grown up in the church, you've been to a bunch of sermons, there's always, that old guy that gets up on stage and talks about the word. Typically, pastors are older. I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm younger, but it's good. But you hear the pastor get up on stage and talk about the good news of Jesus Christ dying on the cross, and after a while, it starts to just become another story. But hopefully, as you continue to read throughout scriptures, when this good news is administered to someone, it's not just another story. It's not just something to take lightly. It's not something just to roll your eyes and say, I've heard this before. But you see that this story of Jesus changes everything. And if you've been saved by that amazing grace, you know what I'm talking about. When God has invaded your heart, when Jesus has captivated you, what happens is everything changes. How you think, how you function, how you act. You understand that this grace wasn't a cheap grace. And it's not just to be spent time in and time out, but it was a costly grace. And oftentimes we try to water down grace, but grace, y'all, is immense. Grace is infinity and beyond. Grace has so much value in that we should always get excited about speaking the good news of Christ everywhere we go. But we see that Lydia receives this. We find out that she was already seeking God. And maybe you're in here today and you have no idea what is going on with a bunch of these weird people standing up, raising their hands, shouting to the Lord, praising God. And then there's this dude with a backwards hat up on stage talking way too fast about the good news of Jesus Christ. And you're like, what is happening? I just want you to know, the Bible says, for those who seek, they'll find. And we find out that Lydia was seeking. And I want to encourage you guys, if you haven't been seeking after Jesus, I want to encourage you, maybe start today. Ask big questions. Ask big questions. And all of us have questions, whether you want to admit it or not. You have questions. Ask those questions, but go on a journey to find out the answer. Go and ask people that maybe can counsel, help, or direct you. Ask questions. Because that's where that beginning of searching starts. Ask those questions. Now, Lydia also, we find out that God opened her heart to receive. As she was seeking, God opened her heart to receive, and then she responded by getting baptized. She was immediately baptized in verse 15, as we saw, and the salvation story that she was receiving was also infectious to her entire family. Her whole family was baptized as well. All right, let's keep on moving. Verse 16. And it happened that as we were going to the place of prayer, a slave girl having a spirit of divination met us, who was bringing her masters much profit by fortune telling. Verse 17. Following after Paul and us, she kept crying out, saying, these men are bondservants of the Most High God, who are proclaiming to you the way of salvation. Verse 18. She continued doing this for many days, but Paul was greatly annoyed and turned and said to the Spirit, I command you in the name of Jesus Christ to come out of her. And it came out at that very minute. Verse 19, but when her masters saw that their hope of profit was gone, they seized Paul and Silas and dragged them into the marketplace before the authorities. And when they had brought them to the chief magistrates, they said, these men are throwing our city into confusion, being Jews, and you are proclaiming customs which it is not lawful for us to accept or observe, being Romans. Okay. Things are going to get kind of weird, so just stay with me. We need to look at what's happening here. If you're like me, I read this and you read it and you're like, okay, a lady of divination. She could foretell the future. Obviously, that's a demonic presence. We find out within that demonic presence that Paul actually speaks to the demonic presence and the demonic presence leaves. When we read that, it's very true. That's accurate. That's what happens. But what's interesting is when we get a little bit of the cultural context that goes along with this. When we start to see the cultural context of what is happening here, it kind of opens up the picture a little bit more, okay? With this, we find out that this slave girl had the spirit of divination. This Greek word, spirit of divination, literally is Python, the spirit of Python. Interesting. The spirit of Python. Now, this definition is also said to be a name given to a person that is a ventriloquist soothsayer. A ventriloquist soothsayer. The spirit of Python, the ventriloquist soothsayer. Which is really interesting because when I think of a ventriloquist, I think of that crazy dude that has a puppet on stage and he's like, and he could talk without talking. You know what I mean? I don't know how to do that. Can anybody do that? If so, you're cool. But that's what I think of with the ventriloquist, right? And what's interesting is we have to look back at the origins of ventriloquists. Where did they begin and where did they start? And a ventriloquist, if you didn't know, it gets its origins from religious practices among the ancient Greeks and the Romans. That's where it started. But also, the name comes from the Latin word to speak from the gut, to speak from the stomach. Ancient people thought the noises produced by the stomach were voices of the dead. The voices of the dead. And the ventriloquist would be able to interpret these noises from the gut. From the gut. But also we find out a soothsayer or a fortune teller. In ancient times, a soothsayer would read the entrails of a slaughtered animal to predict the future. Okay, that just sounds demonic all over the place, does it not? We can see all of this. But if you go even further back, within the Greek word, the divination, a python, this concept comes from the Greek city of Delphi, where the god Apollo was to embody a python snake. The original priestess at Delphi was said to be possessed by Apollo and able to predict the future. Therefore, anyone possessed by the python spirit could foretell of the coming events. So now we find out a little bit about the culture. It was all linked to the religion of the Greeks and the Romans. This religion believed in this god, Apollo, that he was able to possess priestess or priests to communicate the future. And because of that, these people were often sought after in this community. But if you look at how dark, how twisted this was, and I see this even to this day, that Satan and his demons prey on the worship of false gods. They prey on the people of false gods. They use that to contaminate the word of God, to confuse people. And we find out this lady with this spirit of a python that was really, let's be real, was possessed by a demonic entity, a demonic force. And we find out this lady was communicating something really good. Did you see what she was saying? As she was following Paul, she was saying, these men are bondservants of the Most High God who are proclaiming the way to salvation. But did you notice that Paul gets straight up annoyed with this girl and says, hey, demon, be gone. After several days, be gone. And I scratched my head. What on earth? Why is he annoyed with that? She's saying something really, really good. And I want you to look into this a little bit more. Have you looked into other religions? Have you seen that the things that they're saying in certain areas are really good? They're really right. But have you noticed something? The moment there's an evil force, a demonic thing attached to that, what happens is just because it's a good thing doesn't mean it's a God thing, and it's tainted. Therefore, people get confused as to what is true. It's tainted. Therefore, Paul sees this, that this demonic girl is following, saying something good, but the attachment to her was causing confusion of the true message of the gospel. Paul and the boys definitely wanted to talk about the good news of salvation, that they were bond slaves, bond servants. Furthermore, guys, I need you to understand something. You are bond servants of the Most High God. Sometimes I think we don't understand that. I'm speaking from experience personally, okay? But the moment you've given your life to Jesus, things do change. If you look at what a bondservant is a person that loves his master so much. He's paid off his debt already, and he desires to continue to serve his master. What they would do is take a nail and put that nail through his ear at the doorpost. That sounds rad. We should all do that. No? No, okay, never mind. But that's what they would do. And that symbolized that they were a part of the household. And what they would do as they continued to walk out their life, they were obedient to their master. Guys, when we give our life to the Lord, hopefully we understand that we are now called in obedience, a bondservant to the Lord, to do as he pleases. And if we do that, guys, as you see with Paul, time in and time out, people's lives around you will be changed, but God will be able to use you in mighty ways, in ways that you never thought were possible. Honestly, as I dive deeper into the Lord, he blows my mind even more with the possibilities that nothing seems impossible with the Lord because he is able. And if he's called me to it, then my goodness, I don't know what I'm trying to say. My goodness, that God will make sure to give me the strength to get through it, y'all. You have a God, man, that is so powerful, so mighty, that he can cast out demons. That God brings salvation to people. That God has given us that beautiful gift. That beautiful gift. My goodness, I'm not going to be able to get through all of this, but I need to talk to you, okay? We need to find out a little bit more about the culture once again. I told you I'm nerding out about history today, okay? I love history. Do we have any history fanatics? You guys all about history? Some of you are like, yeah, and then others are like, I hate history. It's the worst. I get it. Now, Paul and Silas, we find out in verses 20 to 21, they're brought before the chief magistrates, okay? When you read this, you're like, oh, they're brought before the authorities. Whoop-de-doo. It's just another day. They're in trouble. But you need to understand something. Chief magistrates weren't just like any small deal. They didn't just go to small courts. They went to the real deal, the head honcho of this colony. If you didn't know, the Roman Empire would choose 2 leaders, and they were known as the chief magistrates of that Roman colony. They would oversee the army. They would preside over the Senate, and they were representatives of the state of foreign affairs within that colony. They were the guys, okay? They weren't just small deal, and for you to be brought before the chief magistrate says something. That this was a very big deal. It wasn't just that they saved this girl, but they were being brought before the law in a very disciplinary action right away. And we have to ask ourselves, what is going on? Why is this such a big deal? Why is this such a big deal? And for us to understand that, we also need to understand what was happening during that time. And what was happening during that time, where you could find in Acts 18, verse 2, that Emperor Claudius has actually expelled all of the Jews out of the Roman Empire, the Roman city. And this little Roman colony would then also desire to follow in the ways of Rome. You would see that there was anti-Semitism very aggressive within these colonies, that they were ridding the Jews, getting rid of these people. And if these people were trying to influence the Roman people or to convert them to Christianity, that was an offense against the Roman Empire. If you know anything about the Roman Empire oftentimes would colonize these cities, and they would allow religious activity to take on. You could continue in your religious activity, but there was a rule that if there was a Roman citizen, you were not to convert that Roman citizen. And what they see here is that these people, Paul and Silas in particular, were trying to proclaim customs that you see in verse 21, that they were not allowed to accept or observe being Romans. They were not allowed to accept that because they were trying to convert, quote unquote, these people. Which also helps us explain a little bit. Do you remember there were 4 guys that were on this missionary journey? But we only find out Paul and Silas get in trouble. If you are like me, once again, you ask, why? That's a good question to ask. Why? Why is Paul and Silas taken, but not Timothy and Luke? And that is a great question. What we find out in the first part of Acts 16, we find out that Timothy was actually a half-Gentile. In verse 1, you could find out that his mom was Jewish, but his dad was a Gentile. So therefore, he wasn't full Jewish. Therefore, he wasn't taken under this order or this custom of anti-Semitism, okay? But we also find out Luke was probably a Gentile as well. According to Colossians 4, it actually lists him under the Gentile list and not the Jewish list. So they were able to escape this rather than being put into bondage, as we find out with Paul and Silas. My goodness, I have every now and then I look at the clock and I'm like, oh crap, we don't have time. But we're going to keep going. We're almost there. Verse 22, let's read that real quick. Verse 22. The crowds rose up together against them, and the chief magistrates tore their robes off of them and proceeded to order them to be beaten with rods. When they had struck them with many blows, they threw them into prison, commanding the jailer to guard them securely. And he, having received such a command, threw them into the inner prison and fastened their feet in the stocks. But about midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns of praise to God, and the prisoners were listening to them. And suddenly there came a great earthquake, so that the foundations of the prison house were shaken. And immediately all the doors were opened, and everyone's chains were unfastened. When the jailer awoke and saw the prison doors open, he drew his sword and was about to kill himself, supposing that the prisoners had escaped. But Paul cried out with a loud voice, saying, "Don't harm yourself, for we are all here." And he called for the lights and rushed in, and trembling with fear, he fell before Paul and Silas. And after he brought them out, he said, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" Let's blaze through this passage real quick, y'all. 22 through 24, we see the chief magistrates tear their robes, give the command for them to be beaten by rods. So you guys know the chief magistrates were the overseers of the Roman colony. They would also have people, bodyguards, kind of like Secret Service, to the President of the United States, kind of like that. They would have bodyguards named Lictors. Lictors were interesting characters. The reason being is they would follow the chief magistrates everywhere they go, but they were also in charge of clearing the way for the chief magistrate or punishing the people that the chief magistrate has ordered to be punished. Now, these lictors would always carry an item with them. This item is called a fasces. You could show that picture if you wanted to. A fasces is a wooden rod. It's a bunch of wooden rods all together, bound together, and as you can see in the middle, an axe head would come out as well. Now, these fasces represented a few things, okay? What they represented was a symbol of power and authority. Power and authority. They had the power to discipline their subjects. But also it represented the power over life and death. Think about this. If you were hit with the rod side, you would live. It would hurt, but you would live. But if you were hit with the axe side, you probably wouldn't live, right? Yeah, that would be a bad day if you were hit with the axe side. And these fasces would be used in a disciplinary action as they would beat with rods these people. Now, we also need to understand a little bit about these rods because in verse 23, we find out that they were beaten with these rods. And the Jewish custom You could find this in Deuteronomy 25, verse 3, talks about that the Jewish custom, they were not allowed to beat someone over 40. You remember that with Jesus, who was beaten 39 times. Typically, they would beat the person 39 times so they would not go over the 40. The Roman Empire, they didn't abide by that. If you notice, it says that they were beaten many times, many blows, showing us that it was an abundance of hits that were against them. So much so that their skin and things were broken. For sure, they were bleeding. But what was crazy to me, guys, as they were beaten and that they were guarded securely, probably in a dungeon, the inner cell, so that they could not be released, we find out that they were also in stocks, not just chains, but stocks. Their feet were attached to a wooden stock. You know what a stock is? Can you imagine just being stuck in a stock for like ever? That would not be fun. That would not be fun. But they were stuck in there. But I want you to hone in on this, and this is my closing argument, y'all. I want you to hone in on this. Paul and Silas were just beaten. They were beaten aggressively for doing what God has called them to do. They were making an influence in Philippi. People were getting saved. And what ended up happening is the culture of Philippi came against them in a mighty way. They were thrown into prison. And I want you to get a glimpse of the prison cell. The prison cell wasn't a pity party. They weren't complaining about the situation that they were in. They weren't crying or mourning. They weren't freaking out in a panic attack. What were they doing? And this is very important for all of you because I know firsthand when something goes sour, the immediate human response is want to complain, want to whine, want to blame God even. And what is crazy is God uses a hurt situation to bring another to saving grace. And I hope you hear me. If you have been beat up by this world, if you have been put into a cell, so to speak, you've been hurting and in pain, please get something. If you find that there is still joy amidst the battles, that you have every reason to praise the Lord. You have every reason. You have every reason to sing praises, not singing mourning. But they were singing praises to God in the calamity. And what happened? It shows us that the prisoners were listening. Did you notice? The earthquake shook everything. The doors opened. Their chains fell off of them. They literally could have went hopping on out of there, getting down with their bad selves as they walk out, free men. But they chose to stay. Not just Paul and Silas, literally all of the prisoners, it says, stayed. And it seems like the prisoners were able to catch a glimpse of the God of Paul and Silas. They saw the authority, but they also saw the joy of these men. So they too stayed in a place that hurt for a season. Why? Because in that place, God was going to use it to bring this jailer to saving grace. And hopefully you understand something. You are no longer your own. And I know that's a funny thing to say because I still have control of this. But let's be real. As we grow up, things happen. Our body starts to decay. Our family members start to lose their lives. Things start to hurt. We lose our job. We've been divorced. We've lost a child. This life, guys, is full of pain. But I also need you to understand something. Things are progressing, and you have to see it. And it's getting to the point where, just like the culture of Philippi, that this world is against us. And if we cowered, if we're afraid of that, then what good are we going to do? Guys, I understand in your workplace you might stick out like a sore thumb. But please, I said that funny. Yeah, I did. A sore, there we go. But please understand something, guys. You stand out for a purpose. And just in the same way, the jailer came and cleaned the wounds of Paul and Silas. I want you to look at that. You might get beat up in this world, but as you stay faithful to the Lord will also send one to clean the wounds that you've received, so those infections won't grow. But I also need you to see the last thing. Because of that, there was a friendship. There was a like-mindedness between those men. So much so that they were able to do life together, to fight together. They had one vision ahead of them, the saving grace of Jesus. And right away, what do we see? The jailer was brought to the Lord, but also responded to get baptized. Guys, if you're in this place today and you have not been baptized, I want to encourage you right after service, y'all, to come on up. I understand you're wearing your fancy clothes. That's okay. It could get wet. You've put them in the washer before. That's what happens, by the way. They get wet in the washer. But guys, I want to encourage you to come on up, to be baptized, to just be connected to the Lord's death, but also brought up in his life as well. Yes, this doesn't save you, but what this does is it links your body and your spirit together. What you do with your body matters. We see sacraments in the Old Testament. They were fulfilled by Jesus. But what's interesting is Jesus actually left us a couple other sacraments or tokens to remember him by. He brought us communion, bread and wine. But he also brought us the waters of baptism. And what this does, guys, as we are submerged, we are reminding ourselves, I have died in this life. It is no longer me that walks, but it is Christ within me. I am a new creation. I am cleansed by the saving blood of Jesus Christ, and that is the only reason that I am able to have hope and to rejoice in the eternity to come, because God has saved me.